All right, thanks, Steve, very much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. This evening, my topic is one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the cult statue of Zeus inside his temple at Olympia in southern Greece. The temple was part of a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus that also hosted the Olympic Games. The statue was a monumental work of art, more than 40 feet tall, made of gold and ivory over a wooden model, and seated majestically on a cedar wood throne decorated with sculpted reliefs in gold, ivory, ebony, and precious stones. The sculptor, Pheidias, was already renowned in the Greek world for his almost equally monumental gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon at Athens. His Zeus was not only overpowering in size, but ancient sources tell us that its beauty inspired awe and reverence in the beholder. Zeus was the king of the gods of Mount Olympus, all-powerful, but quite human in his weakness of jealousy, rage, and lust. He especially had trouble with his jealous wife Hera for his philandering ways. Yet, as a sky god controlling thunder and extreme weather, he was held in fear and awe, since the Olympian gods were thought to intervene constantly in the lives of humans. We will take a close look at the statue itself, but I want to take you on a journey into the world of the great statue of Zeus. Too often, these great wonders are admired as isolated splendors with little understanding of what they meant to the people who lived with them and what it was like to experience them. So my hope is to contextualize Zeus's statue in his temple, at the sanctuary of Olympia, and in the wider classical world. First, a brief digression about the seven wonders of the ancient world. On this rather silly map, you'll notice that they are suspiciously clustered around Greece and the shores of the Aegean Sea. Well, the idea of making lists of notable things came to full flower in the Hellenistic period, that is, after Alexander the Great's conquests deep into Asia and North Africa, when people all over the Mediterranean world could speak and write in Greek. 5 of the 7 were fashioned by Greeks or deeply influenced by Greeks. Only the Egyptian pyramids and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were not culturally related. The taste of the time ran toward the gigantic, elaborate, and ornate. The great wonders were chosen by Greeks for size and engineering challenge, luxurious decoration, and boldness of concept and execution. In this timeline, you see the life ranges of the 7 wonders, with the life of the statue of Zeus highlighted. Only the Great Pyramids have survived intact in our time. And the vertical line that you see here just shows the very brief period when all of them were intact at the same time. The statue of Zeus falls squarely in the Greek classical period, the apex of the 5th century BC, a generation or so after the Greeks had defeated the invading Persians, thus preserving their independence. This was the time of the democracy of Athens in full flower, and around the Greek world, city-states were building sanctuaries and temples to their gods and heroes. However, the story of Zeus in Olympia opens in an earlier era after the collapse of the great Mycenaean palaces about which Homer sang. One of the ways people reorganized life was to establish new local sanctuaries where they could continue to communicate with their gods. Olympia, in a fertile and easily accessible lowland area in the southern Greek mainland, known as the Peloponnese, was one of the places where such a local cult took root. For a number of reasons, a handful of these cults began to draw pilgrims from wider regions. Visitors from near and far came to Olympia to sacrifice a sheep or an ox to Zeus, or to Hera, or to the local hero Pelops. They might instead leave a bronze votive offering of an animal or a bronze cauldron. Centuries before there was a Temple of Zeus at Olympia, he was worshipped at an open-air altar. And on the previous slide, I'll just note that's depicted right here, the altar of Zeus. He was worshipped at an open-air altar on which sacrificial victims, usually sheep or goat or cattle, would be slaughtered at a lower platform, and then the thighs, wrapped in fat, were taken to the top of the altar and burned as an offering to the god. The ashes from the burnt offering were then mixed with water from the nearby sacred Alpheus River and added to the mound. By the time the Greek travel writer Pausanias visited in the 2nd century AD, the altar had grown to about 7 meters high and looked something like this. Now, nothing of the altar remains today, but deposits of ash and broken votive offerings have been found scattered around the area during excavations. In the 8th century BC, an important development was the temple as a formal and monumental structure. The temple's original and most important function was to house the cult statue of the god or goddess, as well as the dedications made to him or her. It was not a place of assembly like a modern church. The main cult activity was the sacrifice on an altar that usually stood in front of the temple's eastern facade. Now, we can already recognize the architectural form of the temple at the 8th century sanctuary of Hira on the island of Samos. And there you see here the earliest temple in the 8th century, already having this very long, sort of narrow plan, and you see altars then out in front on the east side of the front entrance into the sanctuary, into the temple, and a later, more elaborate version. And this is just a view of what the interior might have looked like with the cult statue at one end. Later Greeks believed that the original cult statues were made of wood called xoanon, and in the 2nd century AD, the Greek traveler Pausanias was shown the remains of many of these, which were deemed to be especially old and sacred. The cult statue, housed in a permanent building, changed the nature of the relationship between the god and the community by establishing a permanent presence within the community in a specific real place. These centuries also witnessed the emergence of a few Panhellenic sanctuaries whose reputation and importance grew so great that they were patronized by Greek-speaking people all over the Mediterranean. The phenomenon went hand in hand with two other developments: the establishment of Greek colonies across the Mediterranean and beyond, from Spain to the farthest reaches of the Black Sea, and the rise of a wealthy aristocratic class across the Greek world. The Panhellenic sanctuaries were places where elites could compete with one another in games or in rich dedications to the gods, and they were meeting places where Greeks from the vast diaspora could return to old Greece for cultural connection and to establish their credentials as true Greeks. Some of the Panhellenic sanctuaries were known for their games, particularly Olympia, of course. In this slide, you see the location of the most important of the Panhellenic games at Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and Isthmia. Here is the Panhellenic Sanctuary at Delphi, famous for the oracle of Apollo, who was consulted by individuals and cities alike. The Olympic Games were held as part of a 5-day festival in honor of Zeus. The religious association of the Games was strongly emphasized, especially in the earlier centuries. Despite this, politics, commercialism, and cheating were always a part of the Games, as they are today. They were held every 4 years for a truly remarkable continuous run of more than 1,000 years, finally ending by edict of the Christian Emperor Theodosius I. The athletic competitions were interwoven with a program of sacrificing and feasting, and again, they were an arena for competition among cities and elite individuals. We know a great deal about the Games because so much literature describes the events and the victors, And the events were often depicted in sculpture and painted scenes on pottery, just one of the many, many examples here. Let us now turn to the sanctuary at Olympia. In this aerial view, you can make out the foundation of many of the buildings that stood in the sanctuary. So the Temple of Zeus, the ruins of it are here. The temple to his wife Hera are there. And I'll point out the workshop of Pheidias is here. The plan of the sanctuary in Roman times shows that, as in all Greek sanctuaries, profane and sacred space were clearly segregated, usually by a wall surrounding a plot of sacred land known as the temenos. At Olympia, the sacred area was called the altus. The temples and the altars were located within it. So here you can see very clearly a wall which segregates this sacred area here called the altus from the other things going on out here, which were things like exercise grounds, hostels, and the stadium over here, the hippodrome, is off the screen. But the sacred area was the altus. In this reconstruction, you can see clearly the wall marking out sacred space, and also how the Temple of Zeus dominated the altus. When the Temple of Zeus was constructed in the mid-5th century BC, there were far fewer structures. In fact, in the 470s, after the Persian Wars, there was not yet even a Temple of Zeus. So again, just pointing out the locations, Zeus's ash altar is here, his temple is here. Now normally, the ash altar is going to be out in front of the temple, but I think you can see what happened here. The ash altar was much older, and it was near the shrine of Pelops, so there was really no room to put the Temple of Zeus, so it needed to be in another location, and that's the reason for that. Hera's altar, as you can see, is right out in front in the normal kind of position for the sacrificial altar. The dates of construction of the temple between 470 and 456 BC are closely controlled by two historical events. The temple was built from the spoils of a victory by the people of Elis, who controlled the sanctuary for most of its history, over their neighbors in Pisa in 470 BC. And the lower date comes from a Spartan dedication on the temple's pediment of spoils from a victory over Athens in 456, showing that the roof had been finished by then. So we have a pretty good sense of the construction dates of the Temple of Zeus. So all that remains of the temple today are foundations and a scatter of column drums and other architectural fragments. So these are the ruins, and today it's a beautiful place, a lovely setting, very serene, but it's really just a pile of ruins. A couple additional views. You can see how when the temple was destroyed first in an earthquake, the columns came down and the column drums separated, are now in these little piles. And just another view of some of the foundations and broken pieces of the temple. But these remains indicate clearly that this was a canonical temple of the Doric architectural order and very much a product of its times. So here is the basic plan of a Greek peripteral temple, and the parts are, first of all, the single peristyle or colonnade around the building. So the colonnade going around the exterior of the building is called the peristyle. The temple is entered on the east through a porch called the pronaos, and one goes from the porch into the main room, large room of the temple called the cella or the naos. And at the rear of the cella will be the cult statue, right? And so those are the main, and behind accessed not through the cella, but around from the back, is a small false porch and a small room here called the opisthotomos, and often that room functioned as a place to keep the treasure, the extremely valuable dedications to the god. In the Doric order, the entablature, transitioning between the ceiling and the roof here, carries a continuous frieze around the building that is decorated with alternating triglyphs and metopes. So the triglyph and the metope, here you can see the alternating, the triglyphs here, the metopes here, and then the gable, the slanting gable of the roof here, this internal part is called the pediment. The metopes were often decorated with relief sculptures and brightly painted. So you can see here painted metopes and a sculpted relief, which was also painted. So of course, as most of you probably know, Greek temples were painted in very bright colors. They were not these pure white, large buildings. And here's an example of a Doric temple. This is the Doric Temple of Hera in Paestum in southern Italy. It's almost exactly contemporary with the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. And it shows what a Doric temple would look like if it were still standing. And there's a human usefully standing around for scale. So there's a human, so you can get a sense of the scale. So here you can see that from the plan and elevation, that the Temple of Zeus is a canonical Doric temple with a standard peristyle, that is colonnade, of 6 columns on the short side, 13 columns on the long side. And you can see the dimensions, 230 feet in length, 68 feet up to the top of the roof, and 95 feet wide in the front. Now, if we pop off the roof of the temple, you can see how the parts come together, and I've marked the location of the statue of Zeus in the rear of the cella, here, it would have been back in here, and the sculptural programs on the east and west pediment, as well as on the metopes over the front and rear porches. So the pediment here, we have the east pediment, the west pediment on this end, and internally, inside, above the porches, you have Heracles' labors, 6 of them, the 12 here, and the other 6 of the 12 labors of Heracles back here on the back porch at the opisthotomos. And the mythological stories that they tell are closely connected with the sanctuary and with the Olympic Games as well. So let's take a quick look at the pediments and the metopes. So the temple might have looked something like this. This is a reconstruction of a painted temple. So again, the bright colors. Okay, the west pedimental sculpture is called the Centaur Almaki, or the Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs. So the human Lapiths and the Centaurs is a well-known myth. The Centaurs, half man, half horse, were considered friends of mankind, but they were invited to a wedding in northern Greece by the king of the Lapiths, Perotheus, to his wedding. And the Centaurs got drunk and tried to rape the Lapith women. And with the help of the hero Theseus and the god of Apollo, who intervenes in the event, the Centaurs were soundly defeated. This would have been, for any Greek looking at this pediment, would have instantly known this story. The east pediment contains a local story of great importance because it concerns the local hero Pelops, who had a shrine in the Altis and was venerated by the people locally. The story is that he was a suitor for the hand of Hippodamia, the daughter of the local king Oenomaus. Oenomaus had no wish to release his daughter. So accordingly, any suitor had to first beat him in a long chariot race to get the hand of his daughter, and if they failed, they were killed. He had Greece's best horses and best chariot driver, with the result that the previous 13 suitors were all killed. Now, there are two versions of what happened with Pelops. Pelops managed to defeat and kill Oenomeus by defeating him in this long chariot race, and there are two versions of how he did it. One of them is that Poseidon, the god Poseidon, who was Pelops' former lover, gave him horses with wings, and that allowed him to outrun Oenomeus. The other is that he bribed Oenomeus' driver to sabotage the chariot. In any case, Pelops became the new local ruler and eventually expanded his realm on the mainland so that he's immortalized in the name of the southern Greek mainland, the Peloponnese, even today. Peloponnese means the island of Pelops. And he was said to perhaps have founded the Olympic Games. So over the front and rear porches, the metopes were sculpted with the 12 labors of Heracles. And this is where they would have appeared. Now we've now cut away the front of the temple so that you can go inside the porch and see what is above it. And there they are, the metopes, 6 on this side, 6 on the back side. Now we're really fortunate because although in fragmentary condition, many of these sculpted metopes survive today and can be pieced back together. So we have a very good sense of what they look like. The story here is that in a fit of madness, the Greek hero Heracles killed his wife and 6 sons. So in order to atone for this grievous act and to purify himself, he was required to perform 12 really ridiculously difficult tasks. And here they are. I certainly wouldn't be up for these. I don't know about you, but he had to do all of these things. First he had to do 10. And then when he came back and said he did the 10, 2 of them got disqualified. So then he had to go back and do 2 more. So these are the things he had to do. Now, what was the meaning of these sculptural programs for the people visiting the sanctuary and visiting the temple? They were all familiar stories, but they make explicit connections to the sanctuary and to the Olympic Games as well. For athletes looking on, they emphasize the struggle, the agon, the struggle for the rewards of victory. Pelops struggled and gained a wife and a kingdom. Heracles purified himself and gained immortality at the end by completing his labors. So the stories exhorted athletes to excel in the virtues and athletic prowess of heroes like Pelops and Heracles. Also, there was always a close connection between military and athletic exertion. Athletic training was also training for war. The sanctuary was a showcase for dedications of arms and armor from victorious military campaigns, and also things like statue groups that were proclaiming victories. The Temple of Zeus itself was financed by a military victory over a neighboring town, and so forth. In the battle of the Lapiths and in the versus the centaurs and in the monsters that were encountered by Heracles, we see a broader theme of the struggle between the forces of order and chaos, between civilization and barbarism, appropriate to a generation that lived through the direst existential crisis in the Persian Wars. So the sculpture in the temple touched on many themes that would have had meaning for pilgrims and athletes. We come at last to the statue of Zeus itself. It does not survive, destroyed in the 5th century AD, if not earlier. Although the Romans loved to copy famous Greek statues, there are no known copies of this sculpture. We have two main sources of evidence for what the statue looked like: coins and gems that do or may depict it, and descriptions of the statue in ancient sources. So here you see some of the coins that are based either closely or more loosely on this statue of Zeus at Olympia. And so over time, though, now many of these date to the later 4th century after the conquest of Alexander. You can see that some of these coins say Alexandrus, so some of them date to the time of Alexander. It's more than 100 years after the statue itself was made. So by that time, this statue had become almost a kind of type, right? So perhaps in some of these coins, there's kind of a loose conception of what the type looks like, but there's really no effort to get the details right. And of course, on something as small as a coin, the rendering cannot be all that detailed anyway. This is a local coin of Elis, and it's labeled Eleon, meaning of the Eleans, right? So this is their coin. On the obverse or front, we see the head of Zeus wearing a crown of olives, the same thing that was awarded to victors in the Olympic Games. So it may give us something of a sense of what the face of the statue looked like. On the back or reverse, we see the image of the seated statue of Zeus. This matches the description of our ancient eyewitnesses fairly well, though we have to bear in mind that working on such a small surface precludes many of the details of the richly ornamented sculpture. Now, there are many mentions of the statue in ancient literature, but most simply mention its great size or the awe it inspired. One author, Callimachus of Cyrene, working in the early 3rd century BC at the libraries of Alexandria, listed measurements. So you see those here. The base 6.7 meters wide, 10 meters long, more than a meter high. The statue at about 13 meters high. So it's more than 40 feet high. And authors mentioned that he was so tall that if he had stood up, his head would have gone right through the roof. So he's almost touching the apex of the pitched roof. But there's one source that describes the statue in great detail, and that again is the Greek traveler Pausanias. In the heyday of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, he traveled around the old Greek world, visiting cities and sanctuaries and describing the monuments and the local traditions. He had a particular interest in temples and religious traditions, and he loved to record details. So we are fortunate to have his detailed description. So I'm going to give you some of the highlights of what he says about the statue, but bear in mind that much of his description can be a little ambiguous, so the reconstructions are very kind of wildly. Okay, so first of all, it's believed that Phidias started the statue by building a full-size hollow wooden model from which numerous terracotta molds were made to apply the gold and ivory sheets. Zeus's skin was modeled in ivory, and his clothing, hair, and beard were gilded, perhaps over glass, onto the wooden frame. On Zeus's head was a sculpted olive wreath of gold, like the ones awarded to victors in the Olympic Games. In his right hand, he held a figure of the female goddess Nike, or victory, also of gold and ivory, and larger than life size. So if that little statue was larger than life size, you get a sense of how gigantic the Zeus was. In his left hand, he held a scepter with an eagle perched on top. His garments and sandals also were of gold, and his robes or garments were decorated with inlaid animals, plants like lilies, and so forth. Now, it's hard to tell much about the facial features because coins aren't really detailed enough, but a bearded, garlanded Zeus does appear on coins, and so we get some idea of what he may have looked like facially. The throne was decorated with gold and precious stones, and ivory and ebony inlays. But because Pausanias' description is ambiguous, it's difficult to know exactly what the throne looked like. And there's, again, little detail on the coins and gems. What he says is that each foot carried a sculpted Nike figure dancing. Both front legs of the throne depicted children of Thebes being seized by the Sphinx, this terrible creature with a lion's body, eagle's wings, and a woman's head. Below this, a group with Apollo and Artemis shooting down the children of the mortal woman Niobe, who had boasted that she was more fertile than Hera, and her children were more beautiful than the siblings Apollo and Artemis. So atop the throne back were 3 graces on one side and 3 seasons on the other, the 6 daughters of Zeus. And on the stool, Heracles is shown battling Amazons. On the marble base, many scenes, different scenes from mythology with gods, heroes, and the sun and moon. Here are some possible reconstructions of these scenes based on a Roman copy and on Pausanias' description. So this is a Roman copy of a sphinx devouring a youth or assaulting a youth, and this is the theme that is supposed to be on the throne. Perhaps it is inspired by the sculpture on the throne of Zeus. And here is a kind of possible reconstruction, hypothetical, based on Pausanias' description of a group with Artemis and Apollo killing the children of Niobe, but it is very speculative. In front of the statue, there was a shallow pool. The floor was paved in black stone, probably limestone, with a rim around it of Parian marble. And this shallow pool held olive oil, and the olive oil was used to pour on the ivory to keep it from deteriorating in the damp atmosphere of the wooded grove. So the ivory needed to be cared for and maintained, especially continuously. Okay, now the story of the statue of Zeus is also very much the story of its sculptor, Pheidias the Athenian. So circled there is the location of Phidias' workshop. Pausanias was shown the workshop where Phidias designed and built the parts of the statue. The workshop was located just 30 meters from the Temple of Zeus, but outside the altus. So here, the altus wall would have run about right there. So you can see it's just outside, but it's very close. Right? The statue was so big and heavy that it couldn't be assembled fully in the workshop and then moved. Instead, it was taken in parts to the Temple of Zeus, and the final assembly was done there. But a full-size wooden model that formed the core had to be set up in a tall building that could replicate the size, shape, and lighting of the temple's cella. So here we have a hypothetical model of Phidias' workshop, and this is based on the description of Pausanias, plus the dimensions of the preserved foundations on the site and whatever scrappy remains of architecture that seemed to be left over from the classical period. And you can see that it's very tall. So they're not only do they need to have a very tall building so that they can assemble this very tall core, but they're also trying to replicate the space in the cella, which would include things like the lighting and so forth, and the shape of the cella. Centuries after Pausanias visited, a Byzantine church was built over the foundations of the workshop. But in 1958, archaeologists excavated levels below the church and uncovered definitive evidence that this was the workshop building. Among the finds, they found scraps of ivory and precious stone. So the waste products of this building process. The tools that you see at the bottom, such as those Pheidias may have needed to use, and a number of terracotta molds. And these may have been for the glass parts of either of the Zeus statue or of the Nike that Zeus held in his right hand. But the most remarkable find of all was a simple water jug. But on the bottom and the base of that water jug was inscribed, "Pheidio e me, I belong to Phidias." So imagine being the archaeologist reading this for the first time in 2,400 years. Something connecting us so intimately to the everyday life of this great sculptor. What a great discovery that was. Phidias left his mark in other ways. Pausanias reports that the throne base bore the inscription, "The Athenian Pheidias, son of Charmides, made me." Greek artists like to sign their work. You see many of their signatures on painted pottery, for example. Also, one strut of the throne was said to depict a youth from Elis named Pentarches, who apparently was Phidias' lover. He won the wrestling in the 86th Olympiad in 436 BC, and this is exactly when Phidias was working there in the 430s BC. So the temple was up and running and functioning for about 20 years before Phidias' statue went in. Now, it wasn't just the scale or the workmanship of Phidias' statue that made it so remarkable. The idea of placing gold sheet over a wooden model or frame was not new, but what really was a challenge was working ivory on that grand scale. Zeus's exposed torso, his legs, arms, neck, and face were all of ivory, meaning large aerial coverage was necessary. Now, up to Phidias' time, ivory statuary was small scale, limited by the size of the sections that one could cut from an elephant or hippopotamus tusk. Sections of cut ivory were carved into shape and were then joined by dowels and pins. And this created seams between the sections. So you see here the seam between the two parts, which is then attached by means of dowels and pins. And what they would try to do then is they would try to cover these up with golden jewelry, with hair, with clothing. So here is a seam covered up by gold jewelry. And these, by the way, are from Delphi. They are ivory, and they were found buried in a burn deposit called the Halos deposit that dates to the mid-6th century BC. So in the 6th century, they were still working with these cut sections. So for a large statue, the cost and the weight of these would become really problematic technical issues. So Phidias' solution was to borrow from existing woodworking the technique of cutting the tusk into very thin strips, essentially unscrolling the ivory. In this way, long strips of ivory could be used as a veneer over the wooden model. But there was a further essential step: how to soften the ivory to make it malleable enough to shape into or on top of the molds of the various parts of the statue's skin. And this was Phidias's ingenious innovation. He borrowed another woodworking technique of boiling, soaking, or heating the ivory scroll to soften it and allow it to bend into the shape of the mold. He probably then placed the thin sheet between the wooden core and the terracotta mold in order to shape it properly from both sides. So this figure is from an article by the scholar Ken Patton, who investigated these techniques and experimented with several kinds of ways of softening the ivory. And he found that, for one, soaking in vinegar for 24 hours prepared the ivory well for bending and shaping. So this would have worked. But other acidic recipes, including soaking in beer or certain plant solutions, boiling in wine, and others were known from ancient to recent times. And so this was the secret to covering a huge statue with ivory. And this is an innovation of Phidias and his successors. So why then was the statue of Zeus considered so special that it was counted among the great wonders, apart from sheer size and fine workmanship? I think we have to step outside of the sanctuary for a moment. To come to the temple, one crosses a series of liminal spaces or boundaries from the world of the everyday, from the profane, to the sacred, and then even more sacred space. So starting with the temenos wall around the altar, we enter sacred space. Anyone could go slaughter an animal at the platform of Zeus's ash altar, but only certain people, men, could ascend to the top of the ash mound to then burn the thighs of the sacrificial victim. After ritually bathing, we might then approach the Temple of Zeus. Now, we don't know what restrictions were in place concerning the temple, but it must not, concerning entering the temple, but it must not have been an everyday experience. Going inside, the experience of encountering the statue of Zeus must have been breathtaking. The temple interior was dark, lit only by torches or lamps. In this light, the ivory glows and the gold shines. Darkness enhances the experience of awe. The presence of the god must have been very powerful. Since we are now approaching the season of Passover and Easter, we might think about attending an Easter vigil with only candles lighting the church and the sense of reverence this might evoke. And ancient authors certainly felt that power. Cicero, the Roman, said that the impact of the statue was because Phidias possessed a vision of such divine beauty. In AD 97, another visitor, Diochrysostomos, declared that the image was so powerful that if a man with a heavy heart from grief and sorrow in life will stand in front of the statue, he will forget all these. And a little later, Philo of Byzantium, who wrote about all of the wonders, was certainly impressed. He wrote, "Whereas we just wonder at the other 6 wonders, we kneel in front of this one in reverence, because the execution of the skill is as incredible as the image of Zeus is holy." Now the fate, the epilogue, the fate of the statue of Zeus. It was at Olympia for a very long time, but probably in the 5th century, it was taken away to Constantinople to a private collection. Even earlier than that, the deranged Roman Emperor Caligula tried to collect the great statues of Greece to be taken to Rome and have their heads removed and put his heads on them. So luckily he died very shortly after that, very deservedly so. But there's a story that when the workmen came to remove the statue to take it off to Rome, there was great laughter from Zeus and a great thunderbolt, and everyone ran away very, very afraid. So Zeus laughed, and this didn't happen, and Caligula died, so all was well. But later, the statue was taken off to Constantinople, apparently, to a private collection, and it seems to have perished in a fire in the middle of the 5th century AD. The fate of Phidias was not an altogether happy one either. So he had done the statue of Athena Parthenos a little bit earlier, and while he was in Athens crafting that statue, he had been accused of embezzling materials and was more or less acquitted from that. But when he was at Olympia, he was accused of the same thing, perhaps out of jealousy. He showed the accounts and they seemed to figure. But then he returned to Athens, and seemingly because of sort of political situation there, he was a great ally of Pericles. He fell out of favor, was thrown into jail, and died in jail. So it wasn't altogether happy ending. But the influence of this one statue continued on through history, and there are many, many examples of statues that are loosely or even closely fashioned or modeled after the statue of Zeus at Olympia. And here's just one example. The statue of the seated George Washington in the Smithsonian Museum is modeled after the statue of Zeus, the concept. And just to close, I would say that, again, the statue of Zeus should be contextualized within the sacred space of the temple and the sacred space of the altar, the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. And it's not just the statue itself, but it's the sense of place that gives these things their great wonder and their power and their appeal. And people came from far and wide to go to the games, but also to see this wondrous gold and ivory statue of Zeus. So I do hope that as many of you as possible can go to Olympia and perhaps capture some of that feeling of wonder that the ancients felt. Thank you.